We're fine. Always. Fucking. Fine. Everything is fine. Physically, mentally, and emotionally. Alright. I want to use this. Oh, he hasn't played it. Alright. Ooh, I'll watch that later. Do. Nope, wrong button. Oh, come on, you. Get it together. Do. Your channel. Ooh. Hello. I shall be with you momentarily. Alrighty. I worked all day. I'm tired. But I don't have time to be tired because I need to make shit. So I told myself, because I wasn't doing anything while I wasn't being watched, that I would turn on YouTube and I would live stream and I would make 2 things before I go to bed. So let's begin. And we are going to be listening to Lore Lodge still because I only have 1 brain cell and 3 of them are on vacation.
His family was present at Spence Field that day.
As we were.
Others have looked to more conspiratorial angles, such as an abduction by the feral people said to inhabit the park, or by something else. One of those people is David Paulides, who can be credited with reviving the Dennis Martin story after he included it in his 2011 book, Missing 411, Eastern United States and Canada. The case was in the section of the book dedicated to the Great Smoky Mountains cluster, and if you've been watching our channel at all this summer, and if you're watching this video like a year or 2 in the future,
I've come to the conclusion I need mixed stash bears. I don't have enough plastic jars to use, so I'm just going to be using regular mason jars.
And as I've been doing that, I've noticed that many of the segments in that book are rather short, averaging somewhere around 4 or 5 pages. The Dennis Martin history, on the other hand, spans a total of 17. Towards the end of those 17 pages, which largely tell the same story that we did in part 1 of our Dennis Martin coverage, Paulides includes a bulleted list of things that happened before and after, during and after the search, I should say, asking readers
I really like the colors on this.
Read a storyline like this. A little boy disappears in a meadow at a national park within 50 feet of his parents. Searchers scour the park for weeks with no results. 80 armed Green Beret special forces were brought into the park to search. Strange screams are reported by a family in the park. Something similar to a dark-figured man is seen running through the forest in the park carrying something over his shoulder. A psychic tells of seeing a boy in a cave-like setting. Another psychic tells of seeing a boy possibly in a tree. No trace of the boy was ever found. 11 people have disappeared under unusual circumstances at or near this park. To quickly go through the ones that we have covered 7. Of those 7, 3 were not in the park, and honestly saying they were near the park
didn't know that the bottom was already
a bit of a stretch. They were generally in the same state as the park. And by that I mean that they were on the northern border of Tennessee and the southern border of North Carolina.
Alright, I need a jar for you. Hello. Welcome to the live stream.
For those of you who aren't American,
it's quite boring here, but you're welcome to stay and hang out or whatever you like.
2 different north-south locations. Of the 4 who were in the park, we were able to completely explain 2 of them, Jeff Haig and Mark Hansen. You can go to watch those videos if you want to know what happened. And then Trenny Gibson, it's a little hard to say exactly what happened. We have a theory, but we don't think that it was,
these are like,
paranormal.
Super baby proof.
And as for Evangeline Lorimer, hers might have been supernatural, but it was in the sense that, well, you can watch the video to find out. But to get back to our bullet points, the 10th and final is the lead FBI agent on this case commits self-delete. I don't know how far we are into the video, and therefore I don't know which YouTube no-no words are off the table. Now, much of what David Paulides listed in these 10 points is factual or at least close to it. But there are a few things included in his account that don't exactly mesh with what I was able to find while I reviewed the materials. And speaking of reviewing materials, I would like to review some materials for you. The materials inside this little device, my Fume. We've been working with Fume for a good long while now.
Come on, you bastard. These are not good.
And it's because we actually believe in their mission and we like what they do. When you order your journey pack from tryfume.com,
alright, I'm gonna get the other snippers. I'll be right back.
You'll get one of these guys.
They're
What's inside of this is,
of course
3
they are.
parts. You got your little wooden canister, got this little fiber flavoring stick, and then you have a metal mouthpiece. Now you may be wondering what it is that Fume does. What is it for? Because right now it just looks like a really fancy pen. But it's not just a really fancy pen. It's a really fancy pen that you can put in your mouth and suck on. Did you notice how no vapor came out? Well, that's because there is no vapor and there is no smoke. Fume is purely flavored
Ow,
air.
you fucking whore! Oh, you bastard!
Break bad habits.
Oh, fuck!
I think you know which bad habits I'm talking about. I know for me,
I'm fine.
all my friends will enjoy
In a minute, I'll be fine.
After a night
Oh,
of
that hurt.
different bad habits.
Ah.
It's hard to get past the peer pressure sometimes, and that's what I use this
I just drove the back of my hand to the corner of my desk.
changing this little
Fuck.
file, decide how much air you want to come through, and then
Please don't do weird shit.
good to go. You see, the whole idea behind Fume is that getting rid of a bad habit is hard, but replacing
Oh my God,
a bad
you're
habit
so
with a good habit, well,
There we go.
first thing I'd like to address is
There
the
we go.
issue of
Creepy stories.
psychic tips, the psychic premonitions that can't.
Ow, fucking. I'm having a day, and I will get through it.
Here are some Dropbox tips to help you work smarter. Dropbox Rewind is a great feature to recover entire folders that may have been deleted or compromised. Another great feature is file history.
Disappointed.
With this feature, you can see the different versions of a file and all the different updates that
There we go.
Try Dropbox Files for yourself today.
By the way, the backs of these big eyes are not together. They're clear, and then they put the sparkly behind it.
Search. The ones given by Politis are the boy in a cave-like setting and a boy possibly in a tree, which are references to the tip sent in by Harold Sherman and the one that was passed along by Carson Brewer. We went over how psychics played into the search and how it was received and all of that in part 1, but I will give details on part 2.
There we go.
The latter issue is discussed briefly in the National Park Service chronological narrative of the search in a section reading.
I'm gonna put all the brains back in.
Carson Brewer of the Knoxville News Sentinel called and forwarded a suggestion received from a lady telling us to start looking in trees and treetops and stop looking on the ground. Politis adds that there was no other explanation. You will read about a missing girl later in this book that disappeared and was found high in a tree. Coincidence? Regarding Sherman's contribution, David writes that on July 17, 1969, the National Park Service received a letter from the ESP Research Associates in Little Rock, Arkansas. Harold Sherman, the president of that organization, authored the letter. Politis claims that this letter was in the pages of the documents sent from the FOIA request that he himself filed, specifically noting that the last 3 paragraphs of the letter are very discomforting. And I considered just giving you a summary, but I wanted to read you what Harold Sherman is supposed to have written.
Oh,
Aiden,
great.
At this point, I need to request the mood lighting. Thank you. And now, a dramatic reading. I am impelled to ask you if you know whether or not there have been or are any questionable
And out with the brains
incidents in
again.
this region. Camping out in the wild in this area, like hermits, squatters, and such an individual may not be connected with the boy's disappearance at all. But I feel that a sex maniac, so-called, does exist in the vicinity
Dear God.
who trailed the boy. I hesitate to write anymore as my conscious mind is trying to reject such a feeling. I see something red and something being carried or dragged. Are there any caves in the vicinity? A stream may run through it, or even part of it. I'm always tormented when impressions come to my conscious mind, trying to tell me that they can't possibly be true, but I get a sudden feeling of panic on the part of Dennis. What happened to him occurred suddenly, unexpectedly, and he could not, or did not, cry out. He seems to be struck down by something. The area is rugged. Anyway, Politis finishes the section by reminding the reader that Dennis was wearing a red shirt, and there are mines in the area where Harold Key and his family made their observation.
Right.
While both of those things
Let's
are
put the
true,
tail back in,
it's
shouldn't I?
important to remember a few things about these predictions, and not just because
How
they're
are you?
psychics. First, we'll look at Sherman's because it's by far the more detailed and extensive of the two, with a few main points. Red, carrying or dragging, caves, not crying out, and of course the alleged sex maniac. I wouldn't joke if it weren't so utterly silly. As it turns out, Dennis was wearing a red shirt. There are certainly caves in the area, and it's true that nobody heard anything when the boy disappeared. And if someone did actually kidnap him, then a sex maniac carrying him off does seem like it's a possibility. All of these predictions would therefore be rather impressive, if they were actually predictions. However, as Paulides himself notes, this letter was sent in mid-July, a full month after Dennis disappeared. By that point, newspapers were already reporting that Dennis had been wearing a red shirt, that he disappeared suddenly, without a sound, and that the area was covered in streams as well as dotted with caves and mines. The only thing not mentioned in the papers was the alleged sex maniac, but Bill Martin made it quite clear that he thought his son was kidnapped. Looking back at the one submitted by Brewer, the only point Paulides made regarding that lead was that later in the book, he would talk about a woman who was also found in a tree, which I believe is a reference to Elsie Davis. We haven't done a deep dive on Elsie Davis's case yet, but Paulides writes that she was a 24-year-old church organist in Bethel, Maine, who disappeared on Sunday, July 30th, 1911, just after the morning service. Following this, he turns our attention to another article, which describes searchers finding a
jar to shove up his ass.
How would Elsie have known to comfort herself in that manner? Regarding her difficulty in explaining the story, Paulides goes on to say that it's almost as though the missing are under some type of spell that eliminates
King Alfred the Great, I appreciate your kind words. Indeed, I have decapitated many a foe in my time and mounted their severed head upon my wall as a trophy. Indeed.
Another town in another state is tenuous enough.
But now I must find a jar to shove upon his ass.
Considering that Dennis Martin was not found in a tree. There's also the issue of the prediction of Elsie's case, as Paulides did not provide the name of the psychic or where he read of this prediction, and that bugged me enough that I actually decided to look into the case a little bit. As it turns out, Dave got quite a bit wrong about Elsie's story, including her age. She was 22.
A little mason jar should be fine.
He claimed that she played at the church that morning. In reality, she'd secured a sub in advance, and the nature of the psychic's claim.
I think that'll be okay. Just gonna make sure not to drop it, but I need to go get a lid. They're all upstairs. Oh my god. They're back! Listen to a scary story while I'm gone.
She left her house and went directly north for a long ways, then turned away eastward. She was found today or tomorrow in an angle of the fence near Locke's Mills. You might notice that an angle of a fence is not a tree. To top it off, ads for psychics were placed in at least 2 main papers the day that prediction was published. And this isn't even taking into account the fact that Elsie did eventually explain what she could remember, which was reported as follows in the Bangor Daily News. She was able to remember starting for a short walk Sunday afternoon, but
then we have to fight the Hosta.
Thursday night beyond the fact that she thought she obtained some sleep on
What?
Wednesday night. Later, it is expected her memory may clear, so
Not very.
she will recall some of her experience.
Shoveling tons of gravel and sand do not usually make the day go pretty fast.
Raspberries, which are fairly plentiful now. In addition to that, the Sun Journal...
We had to get the axe out to take the hosta out.
Suicidal ideation, so obviously...
Yeah, both of the big hostas are gone.
20 years of online play with Atlantic Lottery. You can win one of 2 $10,000 cash prizes. Spend $5 on any game at ALC.ca for your chance to win.
Okay. I'll pass the message upon.
Not in such modern terms. It is said, the paper reads, that Miss Davis had been in a disconsolate mood for some time, and only a few days ago, she told a very close friend of hers that I have nothing to live for. I might as well be dead. This was not a new discovery. The paper
not too bad at all. A little sore, a little tired.
Twice before, she has had similar despondent periods,
yeah.
So that her friends thought nothing serious would come of this attack. This
Good night, love you too.
Textbook case of depression. With all that
was my mommy calling to wish me a good night. Okay, this Classica fits. I'm gonna use this one and keep my good mason one for a minute.
Who waited an entire month to report his visions to the National Park Service, and that's if the letter David Paulides mentioned even existed.
There we go. And now we need the hot glue gun.
That list I gave earlier in the video, points 4 and 5 were that strange dreams are reported by a family in the park, and
there we go.
Something similar to a dark figure
and
man
you need to be a little bit more. So fangs, eyes. These are kind of horns. I'm going to keep those. I think we need some ribs, maybe? See what I got.
Which begins with the following
I gotta go upstairs. There's food
NPS
there.
and FBI did conduct interviews on many peripheral issues.
Hello,
associated with
Jackson.
this
Good to
appearance
see you
of death.
again.
One of the more interesting and unusual.
Not here for
issues
very long
Harold
because I'm
Stevens
very
is
tired,
the
but I'm here
interview he's talking about
nonetheless.
seems to have transpired when
I hope you had a survivable day.
FBI agent Jim Reich intercepted Mr. Key and met him away from the park to have the debriefing. That debriefing was the result of something that Key had claimed to have seen. Politis writing that the Keys were hiking near Rowan's Creek in the
This
Sea
is
Branch
breaking.
area
I'm gonna
when
have to
they
get the
heard
wire
an
out.
enormous, sickening scream. The newspaper, he says, stated that a few minutes later he saw a rough-looking man moving stealthily in the woods near where he had heard the scream. At the time, however, Key did
These
not
absolute
missing
shit. They
until
gotta
the
go
next day,
back to
and
the
at that point he contacted
back to the
authorities.
outside.
Section of the book, Politis includes some details of the account, explaining that Keys were driving through the park on the afternoon that Dennis disappeared, and had parked the car along the side of the road to try and go see a bear. He provides a quote from Key, reading, "My wife and daughter did not go far with us. We had gone a half mile or so, and we heard
See if
an
I can
awful
get
scream
this.
that sounded like someone in trouble. There was a stream there. As they approached the stream, one of Key's sons
Can't do
reportedly said,
that.
Look, Daddy, there's a bear. But Harold went on to say that when he looked, it wasn't a bear, it was a man. He added that he didn't get a good look at him because
This
he
is
seemed to be trying to stay
an
hidden behind
old,
bushes. Later
whatchamacallit,
in the article, Politis writes,
hot glue gun,
he
but it
again
doesn't get as hot as the
explained
new ones.
He described the sound they
So,
heard as one
I don't
loud,
wanna get rid of it.
painful scream. From here,
I got a new
Politis
glue
goes on to
gun.
say, as a former 20-year
Gave myself a
law
third-degree
enforcement
burn with it.
I'd like to know what transpired when the FBI interviewed Mr. Key away from the park, but it appears that we will never know. And according to him, this is because the FBI has refused my FOIA request for this case, and the NPS never wrote a report or failed to supply the report to me.
Ghetto,
in
my
regards to
love.
the interview with Mr. Key. For those
I'm
who
sorry.
are perhaps not familiar with the American terms, FOIA stands for Freedom of Information Act. It is the manner by which we are allowed to request documents from the government. A solid 30% of our audience is non-American now, so this feels like it might be a necessary inclusion.
It's not gonna
Basically, the way it works is that in the United States, if you want to know something about something the government recorded, any document they have, you simply file a request, and if that document does not pertain to national security or an ongoing criminal investigation,
It was hot today. I think it was like 21 or something, and we were working behind a house, so there was like no wind at all.
Always happen in a timely manner, but at least we have it. As for the other two acronyms, FBI is Federal Bureau of Investigation. That is the nation's top police, the highest level of
Okay.
force that we have, and then of
We're
course,
gonna
FBI
do
is
some
National Guard,
MacGyving on
which,
this.
ironically enough, is technically law enforcement as well. Actually, in the Stacey Artis
This is-
case, if I'm not mistaken, they did use the fact that they are a law enforcement agency to deny requests for certain parts of the document. And this was in the 2010s for a case that's been cold since, I think, 1982. Anyway, Politis said he finds it nearly impossible that the National Park Service
I'm having an idea.
report about the interview with Mr. Key and seems stunned that they
Let's
didn't even
see.
go to the area and investigate. Papers report that the area where the scream was heard was some 10 miles away from Spence Field, within a couple hours of the disappearance, and therefore rangers found it very unlikely that it had anything to
I
do
get
with
him.
Dennis Martin. Whatever was
He's
said-
wandering on my feet, and if he jumps on my chair and I sit down, he's gonna be a flat cat.
Dave to ask, what was it about the appearance of the subject that the Keys observed that caused their son to believe they were witnessing a bear? This was probably one of the most important
Let
developments
go.
in the history
There we
of
go.
Dennis, he continues. And the National Park Service is claiming they never documented this interview. Unbelievable. Inconceivable! Thankfully, David Politis was able to track down Bill Martin back in 2011, who, in the conversation they had, stated that he eventually got to speak with Mr. Key
Tucker.
and was told things that you won't read in a newspaper, after Dave told him that he was familiar with the Key sighting. According to Politis, it was at this point that Bill dropped a bit of a bombshell on him. Mr. Martin stated that the Keys had thought they saw a dark-figured man running along a ridgeline carrying something on his shoulder. Dave says he again asked Mr. Martin to explain what he just stated, at which point Bill again stated that the Keys had seen and later reported the sighting as a dark-figured man running along a ridge
I'm kidding.
on his shoulder.
I probably shouldn't do this plugged in.
Why the News and Park Service had
What are
never
you listening to?
reported-
I am listening to Lore Lounge. It is on YouTube. You can listen to it for free.
This led to Bill
And it goes over like unsolved mysteries in the US and Canada.
figurehead,
So it's kind of cool.
pausing to contemplate once
And since we're getting into like spooky season,
you know Jim Wright.
trying to get into the
Select
spooky
video of
mood.
Jim Wright, confirming that he was the lead.
This is really fucking bad. That's all I can do. That it just has to hold together for the rest of my life. Okay? For not too long.
Download the Temu app and shop like a billionaire. You only do things. Just soap, actually, water. For my best, when they really come.
I got someone I know who does like antiques and old stuff. Keep an eye out for this Hockley gun if they ever come across it.
It seems that Paulides didn't. So the way this version of the narrative
Okay.
unfolds, it almost seems
Well,
like
it's all
he
squished
saw
back
something,
together.
told the authorities almost
Now if I can
immediately,
just
was taken
put
aside
the
by
sharp
Agent
ends down
Wright,
so I don't
and
stab
selected
myself,
paper
I can
with an
still use
approved
that.
version of the story. But there is a
She's not
problem.
pretty, but
Actually,
she's
there
pretty
are-
to me.
There are several problems. First of all, it seems that Paulides has his timeline a bit mixed up, as he wrote that he did not know the boy was missing until the next day, and at that point he contacted authorities, which does not appear to be the case. The Bristol Herald Courier issue for July 23, 1969,
I don't know what.
contains an article, a portion of which reads, according to Key, he made no connection with the trouble screen and young Martin until about a week after the incident. He added, we talked about it as a family and decided not to say anything because so many crackpots call in about things like that. This is somewhat relevant to the issue of the encounter with Agent Key
Alright.
outside of the park.
Now we plug it back in.
July, according to page 32 of the FBI documents obtained via a FOIA request that was submitted
Yep,
by
this
author and
is-
Detective Michael Bouchard. So far as
I've
I
lost
can
my
tell,
remote.
however,
Oh, wait, there was a
and
fall.
we'll discuss a little bit more later in the video, it doesn't seem that Key ever actually
Did the FBI hide the truth about the Lore Lodge? 5 days ago.
did go to the authorities.
There we go.
They came to him after he went to the press. Like I said, there's more I want to say about that topic, but I'm saving that for later in the video, when I'll be talking about how utterly weird this case is, even once you debunk all of the nonsense. But perhaps the most important part of David's account of events is the claim that he saw a dark-figured man running along a ridgeline carrying something on his shoulder not long after the scream was heard. The problem with this is one that Paulides actually addresses, which is that there is absolutely no mention of this in the National Park Service or the FBI files on this case. In fact, the National Park Service didn't mention the incident at all. That said, the National Park Service side of the investigation, which was the actual search and rescue effort, ended on June 29th, and it was the FBI who contacted Harold Key. So it makes sense that the FBI would have records of that interview and the National Park Service wouldn't. Now, regarding the FBI, I do think it's a little bit odd that there is apparently no documentation about the details of the conversation between those two men, but I don't
Last year I
necessarily
listened
find it
to
odd
like
that there's no
audiobooks,
mention
and we
of
did
the
like all the horror
dark-figured
stories,
man
the
carrying
classic
something
ones,
over
but
his shoulder on a ridgeline.
I don't want to listen to
find
them
that
again.
odd because there seems to be no evidence that Key ever said anything of the sort.
You listen to,
claim that he interviewed Bill Martin.
whatchamacallit,
Since Paulides did not record his interview
Jekyll and
with Martin, or at the
Hyde,
very least
Dracula,
did not
which
share
was
it, then we're
so
going on his
long,
word.
and definitely the guy has never talked to a woman
On the other
before.
hand, I don't feel like I have the evidence to call this a lie,
Call of
either on
Cthulhu.
the part of Paulides or of Martin. But I
Sorry,
do find it
what's the
necessary
credit?
to emphasize how
Wee-hee.
much of the narrative given in Missing 411 Eastern United States is simply inaccurate.
I
For
didn't put a
example,
wrapper on
Paulides
this,
could
but
have
that's
interviewed
okay.
Harold Key
Once in a while,
himself and
it's
asked
okay.
directly if what Martin said was true, but for some reason, David believed the man died in 2010. Of course, 2010 is a year before the book was published, but it doesn't matter because he was alive and well in 2010, and he lived until 2019. This is relevant because in 2016, Michael Bouchard sat down with Harold Key and his daughter and interviewed them. Unfortunately, Bouchard did not think to ask about this specific aspect of the case. Either way, Paulides also referenced the suicide of Jim Reich multiple times, even claiming that he asked Bill if he felt that the suicide had something to do with the cases of missing children. Bouchard, on the other hand, interviewed Jim Reich's son, who gave him a completely explainable reason why he committed suicide that he didn't include in the books, because people don't need to know it. In case I wasn't clear about it, Michael Bouchard wrote a couple of books on the disappearance of Dennis Martin, so he is definitely one of the people who's done a lot of work on this case. He's interviewed a lot of people. There's also the fact that Dave said the Dennis Martin incident should be a case study every search and rescue commander reviews, and that the details of the search should be analyzed and understood for their effectiveness or lack of effectiveness. The only reason I bring this up is that the documents that he himself got released via a FOIA filing include a thorough analysis and review of search procedures for exactly that reason. To give David Paulides a little bit of slack on this, his book was published about 11 years before the FBI released all of these files in response to a FOIA request by Michael Bouchard. So some of the information just wasn't available to Paulides. Unfortunately, that does not account for some of the other things that he got wrong, which I believe are not the result of the aforementioned lack of information, but rather a severe case of confirmation bias at best.
I reject the reality and substitute my own. Here, you fucker.
Towards the end of the Dennis Martin chapter, Paulides says that a major concern that I've developed over the years is what did FBI agent Jim Reich document that could be so damning 50 years after the event that our government cannot tell the public? In many cases, I'd actually say this is a good question because I don't trust the FBI as far as I can throw the corpse of J. Edgar Hoover. However, in this case, we now know what was in those files, and while a couple of them are redacted to the point of uselessness, overall they're pretty straightforward. It can't be said that Paulides is wrong about the FBI dropping the ball.
Somebody's got the zoomies.
Strangely, though for the most part it comes across as being an issue of dismissiveness and not conspiracy. I think that Dave is getting at something else, and I think it's the same something that we've talked about a number of times as we've gone through these stories. As many of you are likely aware, the genesis of Missing 411 was a conversation David Paulides had with a National Park Service ranger, while Mr. Paulides was researching Bigfoot. That's not meant to be a dig, considering we've done our own videos on the topic. I just think it needs to be made very clear that David Paulides is the founder of North America Bigfoot Search, and I personally feel it bleeds into his Missing 411. In this story, it shows through quite a bit in his characterization, or I should say mischaracterization, of the Harold Key incident, in which he seems to have either invented or mixed up some very important details, as evidenced by the following quotes from his book. Mr. Key's son stated that he heard and observed a bear, which was later changed to his father saying that he saw a human. A bear normally walks on 4 feet, not 2. What was the difference in the sighting that changed the description? This next one is phrased a little oddly, bear with me. Martin again stated that the Keys had seen, then we have a parentheses, the paper originally stated that the son thought they heard or saw a bear, end parentheses, and later reported the sighting as a dark-figured man running along a ridge carrying something on his shoulder. And finally, the idea that a witness would mistake a hairy bear for a human doesn't make a lot of sense unless the human was very hairy or they were wearing a shaggy large coat. Most of this can be reasonably explained by the fact that the boys never actually said they saw a bear. They only said they heard a bear. So far as I can tell, the two children themselves never actually spoke to any newspaper, and the entirety of this story was given to the papers by Harold Key himself. As for the Martin interview, there's no way to corroborate that it even happened. In fact, Bouchard interviewed Bill Martin's widow, Violet Martin, and she said that she didn't recall Paulides ever having a conversation with her husband. The reason that I did not go into a ton of detail on that is it's possible she just wasn't home. I just don't think there's a way to prove or disprove whether this conversation ever happened. Anyway, all of that is relevant because of the way that Paulides went on to present the words of Dwight McCarter, whose book Lost, a Ranger's Journal of Search and Rescue, David frequently cites. I have a copy of that book, and it's sitting on my desk at home, and I did read through it for this video. Paulides had better access to McCarter than I did, though, and in October of 2011, he and another unnamed researcher approached McCarter at his home and asked if he wouldn't mind answering a few questions about his years of tracking, to which Dave says he responded, sure. The important part of that interview isn't given verbatim, but based on what I've read from McCarter and what Bouchard gleaned from his interviews with the man, I think it sounds reasonably believable, and I will read it for you. I asked Dwight why one of the children of the Keys would first state that he observed a bear, and then his father stated they saw a man. Dwight hesitated for several minutes, and then said that in and around the park there are wild men. He stated there is more than one. They are hairy, dirty, and one even had an old bearskin that he wore. Dwight was careful with his words, but did state that these men lived in the wild and were essentially living off the land in and around the park. I asked if he thought Dennis was taken by a wild man. He stated at the time he really gave it little thought. The only wild man he knew in the park at the time lived at the other end near the Cataloochee Valley and didn't venture into the area where Dennis disappeared or the area of Caves Cove or Fox Rose Creek. Dwight McCarter made it clear that these wild men
nice contrast.
were humans decided to live in the park. They had little contact with humanity, and they appeared, as the name implied, wild and unkempt. This was the first and only time I have ever heard anyone mention wild men inside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. McCarter, for his part, would go on to clarify to Bouchard that he in no way meant that these were feral humans, just they were people who lived off-grid in the wild. The reason I bring this piece up is actually the very last sentence of the quoted section, because I want to point out how Paulides, who this whole time was harping on the alleged sighting of a man running through the forest carrying something over his shoulder, was dismissive of a ranger straight up telling him there are wild men. To pull a page from David's playbook, the only reason to suggest that it was a kidnapping, but not by humans, even the wild ones, is if you're trying to suggest it was something non-human. That's how David's logic frequently works. Except in this case, I actually think I'm making a decent point. Add to this the fact that Paulides repeatedly mischaracterized the Key incident as a bear sighting, all the while emphasizing that the only way to mistake a bear for a human is if that human is covered in hair. And all of this brings us to the issue of the Green Berets, who are the reason that I was skeptical about the official narrative on this case in the first place. But Paulides goes a bit beyond what I was willing to say, making the argument that the Green Berets weren't just acting alone, they were actually deployed to the specific area where he said he'd seen the man. During his research, he says that it was discovered the Park Service closed Cades Cove Loop for 3 days without explanation. He claims this was just after the Key family made their observations, and that there is nothing in the documents he received explaining why the cove was closed. Thing is, the documents quite clearly state that the road was closed to keep hunters and onlookers from getting into the search zone. This was both for their safety and for the integrity of the search. In any case, he says that one change in strategy could have altered the course of events in this SAR, that being to expand the perimeter once leaders understood that the Harold Key family had a viable sighting. Rather than searching the park from the inside out, he argues that they should have started 10 miles out from where Dennis was last seen into Cades Cove and searched toward where he was last seen by the Key family. Paulides follows this up by saying he believes this is what actually happened and that this is the real reason Cades Cove was closed for 3 days. But as we established, the Park Service gave a valid and perfectly mundane reason for the closure. From here, he adds that the real question is, why wouldn't search and rescue commanders admit to having expanded the perimeter and to including Rowan's Creek and Sea Branch in the search area? I believe the Green Berets were given this task, he answers, and this is why they had special communications and did not interact with National Park Service radios, and why their helicopters were landing at the cove. While I'll grant that it is to some extent possible that Cades Cove was in fact closed for some sort of Black Ops tomfoolery, it's by no means the answer requiring the fewest assumptions, and it's based upon faulty information. I say that because this line of reasoning is dependent on one core assumption.
You
that
need
being
more.
Paulides' claim that Harold Key alerted authorities to what he had seen on June 15th,
Actually, I think I do have fangs.
All the
Hang on a
evidence,
second.
however, indicates that Key did no such thing. The Bristol Herald Courier noting that he didn't really make any connection between the scream he heard and the disappearance of Dennis Martin
There we go.
for about a week. The
My
Knoxville
fangs
News Sentinel
right here.
issue for the 21st also
You.
clearly states that Key
Hi.
said he does not plan to tell the National Park Service or other authorities unless asked, so it's unlikely that he called the FBI. Paulides probably mixed this up because of another part of the article where it said that Key only learned of Dennis's disappearance the next day. And then the next line of the article says that he didn't associate the scream with Dennis for a week. If he didn't realize for about a week, that means that the very earliest he would have told anybody about this would be June 20th or 21st. Since the Green Berets were reportedly already in the Eagle Creek area by the 17th, there's no way anyone was acting in response to that tip. So with all of that said, I don't think it's reasonable to conclude that there's any real likelihood that Dennis Martin was kidnapped by Sasquatch. But the thing is, this case is weird enough without bringing Bigfoot into it. Ever since I first heard of it, I had felt like something was not quite right about the Dennis Martin disappearance. And this was in large part due to just how quickly he disappeared and the fact that nothing was found. But after doing the research for this episode, I came across a few other issues. As well documented as this search was, a few aspects of the narrative have left me scratching my head. such as the location where Harold Key reportedly saw that rugged-looking man, as it seems to change between the 21st and the 27th of July. The News Sentinel article from the earlier date states that the group wanted to go back into the mountains to look for a bear, and that upon arrival in the cove, they got a map and asked where we could go in our car where there wouldn't be too many tourists. It does seem a little odd that a ranger would grant that kind of request, but Harold Key was working in the park and he had been staying in Gatlinburg, so it's possible that he knew the rangers a little bit better and was able to get special treatment. Or alternatively, he may have just not mentioned they were looking for a bear. In any case, the ranger directed them to a road that went way back into the mountains, which Key described as pretty rough. I didn't think I would ever come to a place to turn around. He then followed this road for what he said was 7 to 10 miles until he noticed a sign denoting the elevation as 5,000 feet.
Right, you
and while he
bastard.
didn't know for sure, he believed they were near Spencefield. I will say that one immediate issue here with
Random piece of cardboard.
is that
Perfect.
Ranger Bob Morris told the Herald Courier that the only such sign in the park was 17 miles away from Spencefield. That said, it's possible this wasn't an official National Park Service sign, it may have been a sign about what was ahead, or he may have just misread a sign. On the other hand, it could be that he had read about this story in the papers, some of which listed the location at which Dennis went missing as 5,000 feet, and either consciously or subconsciously inserted that into the story.
As someone who
Either way, it's
lives,
clearly
like,
stated in the article that the
next to
park
the ocean, I
alongside
can't
the
understand
road,
really,
where they
like,
noticed a
5,000
white
feet.
car, turned out
What's
to
that
be a
supposed to
Chevy,
mean?
was parked under some low-hanging branches. It was a 1958 to 1961 model, and while it was obscured, Key stated, "I wouldn't say it was hid, but it was pulled back into the woods." From the car, Key, his sons Jonathan and Anthony, and his daughter Wanda's boyfriend, who I believe is now her husband, a man by the name of Gary Grandstaff, walked up a creek bed for what he said was 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile. About this time, the group heard a blood-curdling scream, and while he couldn't tell exactly where it had come from, he told the papers it sounded like it came from higher on the mountain to him. In Bouchard's second book on the disappearance of Dennis Martin, which I believe is simply called The Disappearance of Dennis Martin, it's sitting on my desk back at home, I don't have it in front of me, he wrote that during his 2016 interview with Key, the man told him that he'd heard a child scream, "Help," and that this was followed by another agonizing scream. Sorry, just another agonizing scream of pain. A few minutes after this, he says that one of the boys told him he thought he heard a bear, and when Harold himself went to look to see where the bear might be, he saw a man behind some bushes across the creek. Key couldn't tell much about him because he was going down the creek towards the cars and was keeping behind the leaves. He was definitely trying to keep from being seen. Again, that is a quote from the News Sentinel article on the 21st. A minute or two after that sighting, Key said he became worried about his wife and daughter after seeing the strange actions of the man and started back towards the car. Harold Key did not investigate the scream itself, but he did think to check across the creek where he had seen that man, because he felt that he might be a moonshiner. After crossing the creek, he said that he found a piece of notebook paper where the man had been behind bushes, and that the paper appeared to be a rough map. According to the News Sentinel, Key said it looked like it had been freshly dropped and had a road name drawn on it, but he could not remember what the name of the road was. In addition to that labeled road, it also had a portion reading camp area, but Key chose to leave the paper where he found it rather than taking it with him. Upon their return to their vehicle, they noticed that the white Chevy was now gone. And at this point, it occurred to Harold Key that the fastest route between where he'd seen the man and where the car was went right past his wife and daughter. Put together, this story suggests that Key drove 7 to 10 miles out of Cades Cove along an access road, stopped by a creek, hiked upwards 1/2 mile, heard a child scream for help, encountered the strange man, and then went back to his car. The big thing missing from the narrative given on the 21st is a firm location. So I used a 1971 map of the park to try and determine what route Key might have followed, and quickly ran into a major problem with this story. If we take what Key said here, then it seems most likely that he went east out of Cades Cove along a road following West Prong Little River, meaning he was probably using the road that is now West Prong Trail, which leads out to Tremont. Should say, I haven't been able to confirm. Say, I haven't been able to confirm 100% that West Prawn Trail was a road, but the map seems to imply that it was, since another thing that I know for a fact at the time was used as a road
Working on
is
some
using the same
monster
dash pattern as
stash
the West Prawn
jars.
Trail. I feel this is also supported by the fact that Assistant Chief Ranger Edward
What do you
Whitmer
think?
reportedly said it is possible Mr. Key was on a road which goes into the mountains above
Kinda
the
like
Trent
it.
Jobs Corps camp, which was
I'll get that out when it
In
dries.
addition, the same July 21st article in the News Sentinel notes
And
that
that'll
Bill
go
Martin,
on
having
here.
spoken to Key, felt the
And
man
that'll
was
be
likely
a
out by Elkmont,
stash
which is
jar
the wrong
monster.
distance but the right direction. I think that Martin was going based off of
I really
air
like it. I
miles
like the colors.
while Key was talking about road
That needs to
When
dry.
Key led officials
A little
to the
bit more. Put
location
that over
on
with
the
the wire.
26th of July, however,
Oh, don't drop
that was
that,
not where he
dumbass.
brought them. Instead,
Alright,
he took
now
them
I
to
need to
Brooks Creek and Sea Branch, which
butcher
is not
something
only
else.
much closer to Cades Cove, but
Let's see
also
what's
in
in
the
the
other
butcher
direction.
block.
When the story hit the papers on the 27th, Carson Brewer of the News Sentinel
you look
reported
adorable.
that Keyes
Let's
had
fix
parked their
that.
car at around 6 p.m., walked 400 yards up Sea Branch, and then returned to their vehicle at 6:45 p.m. When Key originally spoke to the press, he told them that he couldn't be sure when the scream
This
occurred,
looks adorable.
but
Let's
said
ruin
that
it.
he knew it couldn't have been earlier than 3:30 or later than 5:30 in the afternoon. He also gave a much more vague distance of half a mile to 3/4, whereas on the 27th it was only 400 yards, which is closer to just 1/4 of a mile or a little over 355 for our non-imperial friends. Regarding the distance and direction, I find it odd that Key went from 7 to 10 miles along a rough unnamed road to under 2 miles along a paved road. I was able to confirm via an older News Sentinel article that Cades Cove Loop, the road that Key would have used to get to Sea Branch, was paved at least as early as 1961, so he wasn't talking about Cades Cove Loop on the 21st. In addition to
forget
that,
shit
he
like
should have
that.
at least been able to tell people on the 21st whether he'd gone east or west. 21st seems to imply he went east. So why then did the story change 6 days later, and could it have anything to do with him being intercepted by FBI agent Jim Reich, as Bouchard said he was? The FBI is who set up this meeting. Reich knew that Harold Key was on his way to the park, so the only reason to intercept him would be to speak to him privately in person before he reached the park. And that's important because at this point, the FBI was investigating. While the Bureau repeatedly informed the press that they had not entered the search, it's clear from the documents released by that FOIA request that they were following up on
patient,
leads and had
down.
meetings with the National
Just
Park
keep picking,
Service,
just keep picking.
specifically Chief Ranger Lee Snedden, as early as June 18th. My question is, if Dennis was never found and there was no evidence of foul play, why did the FBI fight not just David Paulides, but also Michael Bouchard on releasing this data half a century later? Why did it take 3 requests and 1 letter explaining that they can't just use the exclusionary rule like that for these files to see the light of day? But those aren't my only questions, because there's at least 2 other loose ends that need to be tied up. The first being the strangely isolated activities of the Green Berets. I want to know why the Green Berets were so concentrated in the area that they were, while the Park Service seemed to be directing all other search traffic to the other side of the ridge. I would also like to know
Come on,
why the
don't be
National
like
Park
that.
Service did not launch a full investigation after Dwight McCarter was informed that somebody had come across some child's remains in the park in 1972. According to McCarter, he received this report in 1985, and the reason that it was so much later is because his informant was hunting ginseng and did not want to be arrested for doing so. Part of the reason I find that so intriguing is that McCarter was told the bones were found near Big Hollow. And Big Hollow is just over a ridge from the area I believe was being described by Harold Key on the 21st. I also find it interesting that rather than using National Park Service resources, Dwight McCarter brought in the Swain County Rescue Squad and a team
Oh,
of
you're already
30
gone,
men
but
to search
hello,
the Big
Eric.
Hollow area in 1985. It is also intriguing that McCarter's group didn't find anything when they went to do this, but then again, the source was a ginseng poacher who 13 years later told the National Park Ranger about it. They got the area a little bit off. I mean, the only evidence he gave them was it was near the roots of a big fallen tree, and I would assume there were probably at least a few of those in the park. For McCarter's part, he told Bouchard that after nearly 15 years, the foliage was too thick to find Dennis if he was there at all. To be honest, there are so many more aspects of this case that I could have gone through. I did not have the time. This is one of the most complex, convoluted things I've ever looked at, and for something that has so much documentation, good lord is it incoherent. Definitely when I'm finished with this and I have a chance to sort of format everything in a more, I should say, a less esoteric format that only I would understand, I will be putting it up onto the Patreon, and feel free to have at it, to take a whack at it, see if you can figure out what happened, or if you think I missed anything, if you think that there's something I should have noted, please let me know. It's going up there. If you're wondering how you can get access to it, well, everything that we put up on Patreon is
There's
accessible
two
for $1.
victims.
It's just
There's two parts of every
patreon.com/the
crime: the
Lore Lodge.
victim
So if you want to support us, that's a great way to do it. But
and the criminal.
Mama.
I will protect you. I will protect all of you.
Wild Robot is the best animated movie of the year. You are ordered to return home.
We have to help her.
But what I want to kind of conclude this video with is I just feel like something's not right with this case. I don't know where to point the finger, but I do strongly believe that somebody is hiding something. And while I'm very curious about who, I'm more intrigued about why.
Yeah.
If you think you have any ideas, please let us know in the comments. We do read them, we do respond to quite a few of them, and there have been a number of occasions where somebody has left something in the comments that has led to us finding something and completely changing our minds. I also, in our Discord, which you can get to by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge, I've recently started using that to sort of crowdsource help with things like, for example, researching for this video, there was a document that was a handwritten letter, but it had been scanned in a way that was very difficult to read, so I just posted the screenshots and asked my Discord, hey guys, can you help? It worked. I've been doing it with a few other things now. We're just crowdsourcing investigative efforts. That said, I do want to be clear that when I do that, I take the same critical eye that I take with any other source.
Shove it up its ass.
What people tell me.
Alright,
But
let's
the
not
point
get
is that
snapped.
if you want updates for the channel and all that,
There we
you
go.
join the Discord, because we're in there, we do things. And you should also comment if you have thoughts on this case. You can also support us directly. You can do so by going to patreon.com/thelorelodge
Shoving
and
more
joining
shit
for
up
just $1,
its ass.
or you can join as a member here on YouTube. The only difference is that if you join at the higher tiers on YouTube, you don't get cool things like mugs and shirts like you do on Patreon. What you do get on both is access to our monthly Liquor Lore show. We have not done one for this month, and I have yet to post the one from last month. So I guess the one from last month is the one for this month. Huzzah! If you'd like to support us less directly, you can drink and wear us. The way that you can drink the Lodge is by going to tableauroastingco.com, clicking on the collaborations tab, and ordering Mount Pocono Perp, our signature coffee. I designed it myself. I was a barista for many moons, working at an artisan roastery. I know coffee. If you'd like to wear the Lodge, then you can do so by going to bunkerbranding.com and simply finding our section. We have a few designs. 2 of them are brand new. 2 of them are reimagined old ones, and I think you're going to like all of them. They're also so cozy. They are comfy shirts. If you would like more Lodge, you can get that by checking out our podcast, which airs Monday nights at 7
Not
p.m.
my
Eastern,
favorite.
and goes
I
live
definitely
on Spotify,
don't
Apple,
like
all the other podcast
using the
platforms.
glass,
Still Tuesday, probably not still Tuesday.
but we are desperate.
Probably Wednesday.
So we will
Wednesday
do what we
mornings at
must.
5 a.m.
when we can.
Ready to go. We haven't rebranded that yet, but it will be rebranded to the Lore Lab. For now, it's the Lore Lab official podcast. You can also check out our other channels. We have the History Hut, which we're working on bringing a podcast back to. We have the Lore Lounge. We have the Weird Bible, which has a podcast, but is beholden to Wendigoon's schedule. If you know anything about Wendigoon, you know that is
Here we go. What do you think?
busy schedule. As it stands, however, I think we have like 16 or 17
I
episodes.
don't think I
of them.
want to put anything
Some of
in. I
them
think
are 4 hours
I'm
long,
going
so there's
to
plenty
do
of time.
ribs again. Ribs,
I
eyes,
also have my own
and I'll have the
streaming
horns
channel,
next
which is Aiden
week.
Mattis. It is https://
I think that'd be fabulous.
youtube.com/.
What kind of eyes should we get?
Just like
It's
my
got a
Instagram
pink,
and TikTok.
so I
And
wonder if
over
I have
there,
anything pink.
streams, reactions,
Not really. I'm getting a lot of green and yellows lately, and I don't like it.
We have 2
Let's have-
brand new channels
I think
that are
that'd be
hosted
so
by Not
cute.
Me. Those are
See if I can find another one.
Psychologist, which has a podcast called Basketball Lounge. The record also has a podcast.
Nope, wrong one.
And obviously, one thing that's a huge help is you guys go watch those, and if you don't like them, that's cool.
Ah, here we go. Found the pink.
If you do like them, or you think you could like them, please let us know how the show is
Ow,
going.
fucker.
Let us know what you like. Let us know who you'd like to see as a guest, and we can try and make it happen.
Hey, thanks for
Alright.
stopping by.
Thanks, that
This is the
everything.
world's most
I'm
boring
Andy Madison. Thanks for stopping
live
by the
stream
Lore Lodge.
while I listen to, I guess I'm doing a Lore Lodge right now, and make monsters. out of old stuffed animals. Do-do-do-do-do. Oh, now that's my own fault. I did glue it down. I don't like using mason jars. I prefer plastic jars, but I don't have any plastic jars, so we are just going to make do with what we have today. My goal tonight was just to make 2 things, so I'm doing good. I paint these later. There we go. I still kind of see where the neck separates, but that's okay. There we go. Yeah, I don't care whatever you're selling. Whatever. I'm not listening. I'm not listening. Oh, dear.
In today's episode, another high-altitude tragedy for Boeing, but this time it did not involve a plane. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge.
We did this one the other night. That's okay. I'm busy. I can play. Okay.
On the afternoon of Thursday, July 1st, 2010, Don Storm Jr. and Trevor Lane walked into the ranger station at Camp Muir on Mount Rainier. The 2 mountain climbers were there to report that their friend, 57-year-old Eric Lewis of Duvall, Washington, had simply vanished from the mountain. And this wasn't your everyday missing persons report. Camp Muir sits at over 10,100 feet in elevation, high on the slopes of the tallest mountain in the Cascades Range. Furthermore, the guys weren't on just some sort of simple hiking trip. They were attempting to reach the summit of Mount Rainier, which sits at over 14,410 feet. When Eric was last seen, the group was at over 13,800 feet in elevation. Lewis was also attached to the same rope as both Storm and Lane, but when those 2 men reached the 13,900 foot mark, Eric did not appear. Tugging on his section of rope, they were able to reel it up to find that Eric's butterfly knot was there, but the man
Oh,
himself
that looks like a
was
face on
already
the
found.
mountain.
So far as they could tell, Eric had
Creepy.
unloosed himself from the rope sometime in the last several minutes, though for what reason was completely unclear. The ensuing search involved dozens of climbers, 2 helicopters, and a couple of very strange but ultimately fruitless clues. To this day, Lewis has not been found and is presumed dead, one of at least 84 people to lose their lives to the mountain. And amongst those 84 people are 2 other men, Joseph Wood Jr. and Lowell Lynn. All 3 of these disappearances, as well as 1 live recovery, are grouped together into what David Politis calls the Mount Rainier Missing 411 cluster. My goal going into research this supposed cluster of missing 411 cases was to determine a few things. Were these actually connected? Was there any possibility that it was foul play? Could there be a reasonable explanation for any of it? And, perhaps most
So one more night
mysteriously,
at the house.
why did Eric Lewis unclip himself from that rope? But one thing I did know is that whatever the outcome of the research would be, it all started with Mount Rainier. And of course, when I say background, this is the Lore Lodge, so that means you're about to get a brief history segment. I'll tell you, this one's not one of our longest, so I hope you'll stick around for it, but if not, feel free to skip to the next chapter where we start the actual missing person stuff. That said, in this episode, the history segment is a lot less tangential, it's more directly related to the story at hand, so you might enjoy what you're going to get. Of course, some of you may be wondering why there's a history segment at all. Part of it is that I'm a historian, and I enjoy doing history, and I enjoy sharing history. I feel like a lot of people don't get to learn history the way that it should be taught. And this format allows me to do that. I can make it fun, and I can look into the stuff that's interesting, not the stuff you need to learn for a test. Of course, another aspect of being a historian is the fact that I'm supposed to know multiple languages, usually at least 2, and while I used to be pretty proficient at German back in high school, that's kind of fallen off as I've had fewer and fewer reasons to practice the language. And as an adult learner, it's difficult to find classes that fit my schedule or to find other people to practice the language with. And that's why I like our partner for today's video, Babbel. Babbel teaches you foreign languages not in a textbook format, but through conversations. You're not going to be sitting there learning the individual parts of speech and building your vocabulary from a workbook. You're going to be doing it by learning how different conversational topics function. Rather than memorizing a list of words that begin with the same letter or revolve around the same topic, you're going to learn how to ask questions like, where is the bathroom, or wo ist die Toilette? Essentially, Babbel teaches you how to use a foreign language, not just how to comprehend it. You're going to be learning full, useful phrases such as kann ich die Rechnung haben? Or, in plain English, can I have the check? Now, I will tell you, a German teacher I had in high school, who is apparently banned from Poland, did tell me that you don't really ask for the check by saying, can I have the check? You just raise your hand and yell, ich bezahlen. It means I pay, or I think more literally pay. From what I understand, German is a more straightforward language. Now, of course, if you're German and you're sitting here going, well, that's wrong, don't take my word for it, I could be wrong, but that's what a teacher told me. How did he get banned from Poland, you ask? That's not my story to tell. But really the most important thing that Babbel offers is the opportunity to practice your language. Because to be perfectly honest with you, I think I'm more proficient in reading Old English right now than I am in speaking German. And that's weird, because it was initially my knowledge of German that aided me in reading Old English.
Same one.
If you'd like to give Babbel a shot, you can get 60% off your subscription by clicking the link in our description or in our pinned comment. Your subscription will get you access to one of the top language learning apps in the world, and if you're American,
I guess you're gonna get a bow
reduce that stereotype that we only speak
around your
English.
neck.
And in the realm of only speaking English, it's time to get back to that background section on Mount Rainier, which it has a non-English name. Mount Rainier is 14,411 feet tall itself, making it the 31st tallest peak in North America, but its prominence of 13,210
The hot glue
feet
doesn't last, but it makes a
prominent
base
peak on
to attach to
and
the
the most prominent in the lower 48.
on the fur
In
to attach
topography, prominence
the
is
good
difference
glue.
between the height of one peak and the surrounding terrain, whereas elevation is how high it is above sea level.
There we
The
go.
mountain features prominently in the tradition of the Coast Salish peoples of the region, who generally refer to it by some variant of Tacoma or Tacoma. In English, the translation of the term would be snow-covered mountain. As for the Coast Salish themselves, they were and are the dominant Native American ethnic and
I
cultural
wonder if I
group
can get
of
that on
the
there without
Seattle
having an issue.
Vancouver general area. While archaeological
do sweet
evidence
for this.
confirms a human presence in the Salish territories going back to at least 6500 BC, it's possible and even likely that the area was inhabited much earlier than that, but that their remains were all swept away by the glacier melts. One cultural clue suggesting that these people were here a very, very long time ago is a Squamish oral tradition about a great flood. That flood was survived by a lone family and a number of good animals who made their way.
Before, my fear of leakage and skin irritation felt like a nightmare. Since I switched to TENA-sensitive care over night pads, sleeping brings me joy. Its skin comfort formula
put
acts
that
as a
on
barrier
without
to help protect my skin.
being in the
Plus,
way of
it has
everything.
triple protection against leaks, odor, and wetness, which helps me feel secure through the night. They make my nights smoother and my days brighter. TENA overnight pads. Try them today and have a smooth night.
How am I gonna fix this shit?
Now's the time to book your perfect Caribbean getaway. Book today.
Animals who made their way to the top of Mount Rainier at the urging of the Great Spirit. This could be a cultural memory of the melting of the Cordilleran ice sheet around 12,500 to 14,000 years ago. Though it should also be noted that there are multiple similarities to the story of Noah's Ark held within this tradition. Also, if there's anybody watching the video who is more experienced in anthropology, geology, those kinds of things than I am, and I said Cordilleran ice sheet wrong, please get me, just correct me. I will appreciate it, and I will get it right next time. In any case, as the story goes, the Great Spirit decides that he wants to get rid of all of the bad animals and the bad people, and he chooses a flood to do this. However, his goal is not to completely wipe out humanity or even life on Earth. His goal is to just get rid of the bad and rebuild with the good. So he selects one good man, and he tells him to fire an arrow up at the top of Rainier. And he does. And then the Great Spirit says, all right, now fire another one into the back of that arrow. Also, I keep saying fire, I know it's loose, I hate myself. And the man proceeds to do this with literally thousands of arrows, until eventually they form something of a climbing rope up to the peak. The good man, his family, and all of the animals begin to climb their way up the rope, but as they're doing so, the Great Spirit causes it to rain. Because it's raining, all of the bad animals and the bad people start trying to follow the good man up the rope, so the Great Spirit tells him that he needs to cut it as soon as he gets to the top. He does, and all of the bad people and bad animals fall back to the ground. After that point, it rains for many days and many nights, and eventually the water rises up to the snow line of Rainier. As a result, only those people atop the mountain survived this flood, and it was they who rebuilt the world. Another one of these oral traditions regarding Mount Rainier, or Mount Tacoma in the languages of the Salish people themselves, comes from the Puyallup people. Again, if that is wrong, tell me, I will fix it. One version of the story, which was recorded by Professor Elliot E. Clark back in the 1950s, comes from a individual who says that in the time of his grandmother's grandfather, a prophecy. I have to say, I'm unsure if grandfather and grandmother here are actual paternal, maternal grandparents, or if this is the more cultural term of grandfather used for original. In any case, what's being said here is that this occurred 5 to 6 generations before the story was recorded. So sometime possibly the very, very late 70s.
I don't have anything upstairs I can
As the story
use
goes,
that I
this
know
grandfather
of.
spent an evening by a lake high up on Mount Rainier, and while there he encountered a spirit. In a lot of folklore and their understanding of the spiritual world, there are spirits in everything. It's kind of similar to Shinto, but the idea would be that the trees, the rivers, the mountains, they all have spirits of their own, and the spirit
It's
of the
not really
mountain
good
is
either, is it?
the story of his ascent up the mountain
hello.
describes him using elk horns.
Welcome to the live
cut steps
stream.
into the
We're just
stone
gonna work
fence,
on crafts and people kind of pop in every once in a while.
and was therefore very high up on the mountain.
Yeah, I'm glad I don't have to wipe. I do need a crystal though,
moss would grow out of his body,
or something.
The head of the mountain would burst, and the lake he had stayed by would just flood down. Many years later, the man did grow old. The story says that moss did grow from his body, and when he died, that lake did spill down the mountainside. The story even suggests that the amount of water was such that it just wiped the trees all around the western slope. This one is almost certainly a much more recent memory, and it kind of sounds like maybe a massive...
Crystal might be another day finish. That's fine. I don't know. The yellow doesn't look too bad, but there's no yellow on it. Pardon me?
Then, over the course of the next 1,500 or so years, the Coast Salish evolved.
I don't at all.
The genesis of the modern Salish culture, what brought it out of the
not really.
culture, may have been the development of complex social stratification.
That's the same damn one, pretty much. Same one.
From Baker Bay to the Strait of Georgia,
Not
they
really.
grew up in a
Okay.
semi-nomadic society that migrated to the Lunar County. While there was no centralized government between the various bands and tribes, it does seem that they, in some way, managed to decide who had rights to what territory. And this was not necessarily for any kind of political reason, but to make sure that everybody had enough food. Tribes also varied in hierarchy structure and kinship practices, though it seems that in general, you had the men leading the village and the women leading the household. Kinship was typically matrilineal, but certain bands and tribes practiced a dual system, much like our modern system. And part of the reason this worked so well is that leadership of the tribe was not hereditary. You didn't have a chief passing that down to his son. It was meritocratic. People followed who was worthy of being followed. The meritocracy of the leadership role, however, did not necessarily mean that everything was a meritocracy. Within Coast Salish society, there was a class system, even if it wasn't the most clearly defined thing. Still, some families had wealth, some were working class, and others still were actually enslaved. One thing I did find very interesting about Coast Salish is that spiritually they're something of an enigma, as much of their legends do resemble Christian scripture. As a result, it's often difficult to tell what is original to their mythology and what is a result of syncretism with Christianity. You know, is this Skokomish story of one good man who was selected to survive the Great Flood original? Is it a combination of Old Salish tradition and the Christian Noah's Ark story? Or is it pure and simple just Christians giving the natives their own version of Noah's Ark? We may never actually know, but what we do know is that the first ones who summit Mount Rainier in recorded history were actually led there by a Native American guide named Sluiskin. Sluiskin guided the 1870 expedition of Hazard Stevens and P.V. Van Trump as they attempted to summit the mountain, but as the story goes, and nobody's really sure which exact tribe or band this man belonged to, a lot of claims him, but as the story goes, as they got closer and closer to the snow line, he became more and more nervous, and when they finally reached the snow line...
I don't know if I can take the head off yet, actually.
telling Hazard Stevens and P.B. Van Trump that people who go up to the top of the mountain are
There we go.
never seen again. They're thrown into a lake of fire by demons. Stevens and Van Trump ultimately did summit, beginning a long tradition of mountain climbing on what is actually a dormant volcano. That whole lake of fire thing makes a lot more sense now, doesn't it? Not long after, in 1888, the famed Scottish-American naturalist John Muir summited, but he claimed that it was better appreciated from the top. Despite that review, the National Park Service did name a camp high on the mountain
Wait
after
a
John
fucking
Muir,
minute.
in Muir, and it
I
was
bought
from that
something.
camp that Eric
No, I
Lewis and
didn't.
his friends set out for their summit attempt on that fateful July day.
I spend most of my time trying to make stuff just looking for bits and pieces because I have no fucking organizational skills. I don't know. Yellow.
Jacqueline, feed your wild side.
God damn it. Get out of my way, everything. Two things.
Eric Lewis was no stranger to mountain climbing, and especially near having something to do. And I'm always cautious about using numbers. He does make a claim that some depends on affordable competition. For those unfamiliar with or lacking understanding regarding the variance in urban data politis,
That should have something in it, right?
Politis has a tendency to omit relevant information, get details wrong,
Quite
or make
glittery.
uncorroborated claims. This video is actually going to go over a lot of those discrepancies, but one example of this very case is that on July 1st, 2010, he claimed that the mountain
Might
had
work.
great weather, that it was looking like a beautiful one. In reality, everywhere above Camp Muir that day was experiencing 40-mile-an-hour winds and only 10 feet of visibility. Politis did later get it right and suggested that the bad weather and poor visibility rolled in while they were on the mountain. Like I said, it was there at Camp Muir. According to contemporary reporting,
Ghetto?
most climbers on the mountain that day chose to remain inside of Camp Muir rather than continuing up the mountain. So Eric
That
Lewis,
doesn't make
Don
sense.
Storm, and Trevor Lane were definitely, knowingly heading into rough conditions. In any case, Lewis was taking the Gibraltar Ledges route to the summit, a climb of 4,306 feet over almost 3 miles in terms of lateral movement. This route follows
That
the
doesn't
same
make any
path that
sense.
Hazard Stevens and P.B. Van Trump took in 1870 and is currently rated a route to climb using the U.S. system.
Nope,
Lewis's
still
group set
same.
off from about 10,100 feet from Camp Muir. They then proceeded up
Yes,
the western
most of these are real
Alps
pearls.
Glacier to the Beehive at 1,800 feet. The Beehive is a rock. From there, they Misery at 11,600 feet. And this is where the Ledges part of the Gibraltar Ledges route comes into play. We have a very nearby and nowhere near as far. That said, I did have to run up and down it for rugby practice in high school, and Misery was the right name. And believe it or not, it's not Misery. I grew up on it. Wait, is it really? Yeah. That explains a lot. Anyway, after reaching Camp Misery, they began scaling the rocky, exposed ledges on the side of the outcrop of Gibraltar Rock until they reached the top of
That's
the
a beautiful little
Gibraltar
fish.
Chute. The upper Gibraltar Chute itself.
That's not what I need. Oh, there's where the gem goes.
They climbed the chute
Maybe
until
just a
they came to
crystal.
Camp Comfort, which is on top of Gibraltar Rock.
That could
around
work.
12,600. For the record, I don't
Back.
think Camp Misery
I have so
or
much
Camp Comfort
crap,
are actual camps.
and it's never the right
They were
crap.
the Ingram expedition back in the late 1800s.
Let me
What's
read it.
interesting is that from
Pearls.
this point,
No.
at the top of Gibraltar Rock, it's relatively smooth sailing the rest of
Those
the
aren't
way
even
up.
supposed to
At
be in
these
here.
elevations, the incline becomes far less aggressive, and you're mostly making snow rather than climbing
Yep.
rocks.
All
At
this shit.
13,900 feet,
None of
however,
it is right
all
for what I
three
need.
put themselves to lose. Using this rope, they follow a staggered climb.
And that just opened. I'm not dealing with that tonight.
Help the middleman, Trevor Lane, in this case, up. And then Don Storm Jr. would have been resting, while Trevor Lane helped Eric Lewis. This may have been because Eric Lewis was the least fit member of the group, and therefore might have required the most help getting up. By having two climbers ahead of him, they both could have pulled on his rope if he became stuck, if he became tired, or if anything else had happened. Lane, on the other hand, would have been able to call on the assistance of Storm. However, when they hit that 13,900 foot mark, Storm stopped, helped Lane up, and when Lane went to help Lewis up, he found that the rope was oddly slack. The two men proceeded to reel in only to find that at the end of it was Eric Lewis's butterfly knot, but there was no Eric Lewis. The two men immediately realized that Eric must have unclipped himself for some reason and decided to descend down to where they had last seen him just minutes before. But Eric Lewis was nowhere to be found.
Alright, I
Storm
gotta
and
shit or
Lane
get off the
had,
pot.
in that very moment, been well aware of how
I know
serious
the
the
yellow is
situation
great.
was. Because climbers do not unclip themselves, especially
Right
at that
shape.
altitude, unless there is an emergency
But
or
it's
something
not
that could endanger the other climbers.
one.
Recognizing the severity of the situation, but also aware that Eric was an extremely experienced climber, Storm and Lane decided that rather than descend now, they would see if he had somehow skirted them and gotten to the summit. They went up to the summit ridge, they looked
I
for
don't know.
Eric.
Maybe I'm just calling it a night.
Knowing that this was a situation they could not handle alone, Storm and Lane proceeded down the mountain
Overly,
to
I've
Camp
got
Yard,
two
where they asked
done.
the Rangers for help.
Overly.
Mini wheats, made with 100% whole grain.
Not completely, but their bases are done, so they just kind of need a paint. Fuck, I'm tired. You still look like shit, and you still feel like shit. Why is that pokey? Fuck you.
Due to the late hour, a formal search and rescue attempt would have to wait until the morning, but that did not stop climbing ranger Tom Payne and two mountaineering guides from trying their best to go up that mountain and locate Eric Lewis. Payne led his crew up the mountain to the location at which Eric was last seen in just a few hours. Arriving at the summit ridge around 8 p.m., they still could find no trace of Eric, so they had to return back down the mountain, getting back to the camp at around 10 p.m. I will say, aside from what the Rangers recorded, it's a little difficult to tell what the timeline is here.
No.
It's unclear if they started at Camp Muir or if they started at the bottom of the mountain. Some hikers do this every 2 days, where the first day they go up to the camp, the second day they decide to come down. Some do it all in one go. It's pretty unclear which option the Lewis group went with. The search began in earnest early on the morning of Friday, July 2nd, with rangers and climbing guides ascending the mountain on foot, while a National Guard Chinook and a privately chartered helicopter also scanned the area.
Wanna do something tiny or weird?
By professional guides from Alpine Ascent International,
Smallest little
Rainier
squishmallow I can
National Mountain
find.
Guides, and a number of volunteers from the Olympic Mountain Rescue Organization,
Ta-da!
who spread out across
I don't know what it is.
mountain.
Monkey,
Several
maybe?
groups were dispatched to the Gibraltar Ledges route, but aware of Eric's experience with the mountain, other groups were tasked with searching areas he might have diverted to. One group checked the Ennens route, which runs up the northeastern slope of the mountain,
Nice.
while
You're gonna
another
get
checked the
fucking
Ingram
horn.
route on the southeast slopes. The
Yeah.
Ennens team was made up of National Park Service rangers from Camp Sherman, while the Ingram Glacier route was made up of Alpine Ascent's international team members. Both groups agreed that they would search their respective routes and then meet up at Disappointment Cleaver somewhere in the middle. While those two groups searched the eastern slopes of the mountain, the team selected to search the Gibraltar Ledges route came across the first evidence of Eric Lewis's presence. At 13,600 feet, they found the missing climber's backpack, which still contained his frozen water bottles, his climbing harness, and a snowshoe. But he himself was nowhere to be found. 200 feet further up the mountain, just below where it was first noticed that Eric was missing, searchers also were able to find a small snow cave, presumably dug by Eric Lewis. It's not entirely relevant, but for some reason, Politis attributes this discovery to Storm and Lane, when I'm unsure if they were even involved in the search. A further effort spanned the western side of the volcanic rim atop the mountain, but that was ultimately fruitless. By day's end, the only thing that the searchers knew was that Eric was now without supplies, as everything he had was in his backpack. Day 3, Saturday, July 3rd, 2010, was a more focused search, as basically everywhere else that Eric could have been had been searched on day 2. So this time, the efforts were focused on the Nisqually Glacier and the icefall associated with it, with rangers skiing the bottom of the Gibraltar Chute as helicopters circled overhead, looking for any trace of Eric Lewis. At this point, they knew that they were basically on a recovery mission rather than a rescue attempt, as without any supplies, it was nearly impossible that Lewis had survived 2 nights on the mountain. They expected that
Tiny
if they were to recover him specifically in this area of
unicorn
the mountain,
thing.
they likely would have been finding him
Done
dead
it.
from a fall. Unfortunately, they found absolutely no trace of the man, and with a storm front rolling in, they made the hard decision
Oh, I can
to
finish
suspend
you
the
as
search,
well.
as
I don't know
it
what
simply
to do with
posed
you.
too much danger to those looking, and the likelihood Eric was still alive was essentially
very
zero.
special.
To this
Indeed
day,
you are.
nobody has located the body of Eric Lewis, and nobody really knows what happened on that fateful afternoon. With so little information to go on and no body recovered, This case has seen a lot of theories develop. Everything from foul play to Bigfoot.
Sure you
and then,
are.
of course, there's the mainstream narrative about what happened. All of that said, David Paulides thinks that he may be onto something, and he thinks that Eric Lewis may not be the only relevant disappearance.
It's a mountain. A former volcano.
In Missing 401, North America,
Probably a lot of those
Paulides
lava
outright
tunnels.
rejects the possibility of an accident, writing, "I find it almost unbelievable that Eric unhooked from a safety line and vanished." Now, while Paulides never explicitly blames Bigfoot in any of his books, Missing 401 has always carried something of a connotation that Bigfoot is involved, and this story is no different. I won't go into depth about why I say that. We do have a video on the Missing 401 phenomenon where we analyzed it, we looked at a number of different cases, went back to the meta-analysis of our own research, and then came to some conclusions. I would recommend watching that if you want to get the full story on why we're where we are. In terms of the Eric Lewis case, he doesn't go into any detail trying to prove Bigfoot's involvement, and without context, you might even think he's just suggesting foul play. The key is his decision to include 3 other cases from Mount Rainier for which Eric's friends can't have been responsible. Of the 4 Mount Rainier cases mentioned in Missing 401 North America and Beyond, the most recent is that of Joseph Wood Jr. Wood disappeared July 8, 1999. Before we launch into that, I want to go over the structure of how I'm going to do this. I'm going to give you David Paulides' version of the stories, and then I'm going to give you some clarifications that I found during my research, because they are important. At the time of his disappearance, the Baychester, New York native was 34 years old and working for a publishing company in the city. Also an Eagle Scout, Wood should have been well trained in wilderness survival. The reason he was in the Pacific Northwest in the first place here was that he was attending a Minorities in Journalism conference in Seattle. Because he was a hobbyist bird watcher, he decided he would take a day trip down to Mount Rainier to go and see the sights. He passed through the park's Nisqually entrance at 12:29 p.m. and then proceeded to park in the Longmire Line. From there, Paulides says that he went up the Rampart Ridge Trail, where he was last...
My competition is fierce, sweat, grit, oily.
New Olay cleansing melts. Just soak, activate, wash. For 3 times better clean.
For my best skin.
New Olay cleansing melts.
Vitamin water is so New York. It accidentally stays out until 6 a.m. Everything works to start at 9.
A lot of right-sided ribs. Lefty.
Rampart Ridge Trail, where he was last seen around 4,800 feet. That sighting was confirmed by hiker Bruce Gaumond, with Gaumond allegedly telling Wood the trail terminated just 5 to 10 minutes further up due to the ice and the snow, and that there was an unstable snow bridge that would have prevented him from traveling any further. After this, Joseph Wood Jr. was never seen again. Of course, 1999 is recent enough to 2010 that theoretically Storm and Lane could have been responsible. The thing is, there's nothing to connect them to it, and on top of that, they can't have been behind the other 2. I say that because the next most recent missing person, Lowell Lynn, was 23 years old when he disappeared on November 31st, 1957. I'm going to assume that Paulides meant November 30th, as there is no November 31st, but in any case, the young Boeing engineer was hiking Mount Rainier to go skiing with his friend Harry Holcomb. They intended to snowshoe up and then ski their way down. The pair set off from Paradise Inn at 5,500 feet, then ascended to 7,500 feet before hitting the slopes. The plan for the trip down was to start at the top and stop down at Panorama Point at 6,500 feet before making the final descent down to Paradise Inn at 5,500. However, when Holcomb reached that 6,500 foot mark and stopped to wait, Lowell did not. After waiting for several more minutes and seeing no sign of his friend, Holcomb decided that he would just go on down to Paradise Inn and wait there where he wasn't, on a mountain in the cold. The problem was that even a couple of hours later, Lynn hadn't shown up. And with a storm rolling in, Holcomb decided he needed to alert the Rangers. Unfortunately, despite a considerable effort, no clues were found, so the search had to be suspended 2 days later on December 2nd. To this day, the body of Lowell Lynn has never been found. The third and final example given was that of Marcella Romiski, a 5-year-old who disappeared from a picnic at Chenoweth Falls on July 1st, 1950. It's also by far the most Bigfoot.
Sorry, not very active tonight.
According
I'm
to
very
Marcella's
tired.
mother Kay, sometime
Trying to get a
around
few
5
things
p.m.,
done tonight.
Marcella just vanished. It was
Get
early
those
enough in
two
the day,
guys
and it was
done.
at a pretty low elevation on the mountain.
And now I'm
around
trying to
2,000
get
feet.
this
So, 50 rangers and 2 blood
bear
hounds were dispatched to
finished
go look for
with
the
an
girl.
eyeball.
Oddly enough, despite being given Marcella's scent, the dogs
I need to get the
were unable
horns
to
and I
track the
need like a
girl, and the
pendant or
rangers
something for
were unable to
him.
find any clues as to
And
where
this
she
one
had
as
gone.
well.
I am pleased, however, to tell you that this story actually does have a happy ending. Around 9 a.m. the next morning, 2 volunteer searchers by the names of Jack and Donald Noel managed to locate Marcella up on a ridge through their binoculars.
Oh,
She was
good
about 2
lord,
miles
get
uphill
over.
from where she
I
and
have
her
to
mother were having
work.
their picnic,
Let me get something
and
else
the
done.
papers initially
then
reported
we'll
that
go
she was
snuggle.
covered in scrapes and bruises. However, as Politis notes, the odd thing is, later that day, they changed the story. Essentially, the witness statements reported by the Kingsport News said that she had cuts and scrapes all over, but the Ranger's statement given to the Nevada Journal said that she was completely unharmed. She was in good condition and had no injuries. He also tells us that the Kingsport News said that her dress was on backwards and her shoelaces were misarranged, or at the very least they weren't tied properly. The language is not that clear. As for the cuts and
Bigger
scrapes
ribs.
and why they would
Smaller
have
ribs
been
in the bear.
absent from the National Park's version of the story, he says that the Rangers know that's important. And finally, he suggests that it's impossible that she could have made it 2 miles uphill in just 16 hours on a warm July night. Now, Washington and Mount Rainier specifically do have their fair share of Bigfoot legends, and some of them are actually rather compelling, but we'll get to that later. In this set of papers, however,
I think I'm gonna call it a night.
necessary, beginning with the story of Joseph Wood Jr.
Thanks for stopping by. I have achieved my goal of finishing, well, not finishing, but making 2 things, and I finish them tomorrow
The
night.
problems here is that Mildred
Alrighty.
is not a longback group, and that
There we go. Quiet. Oh. Bye, guys. Have a good night. Whew. I need a nap.